that lives primarily underground would find it incredibly difficult to produce a lot of meat, wool, milk, or other dairy products. Their main access to it might be through the human markets, which carry with it the possibility of discovery. Risk raises prices, perhaps enough so to make certain products a luxury. Consider which resources your hidden world has access to, whether with the help of technology, magic, or blending in, and how this affects the market. With the supply and demand of particular resources. Flowing on from this, how does the lack or abundance of certain resources affect the rest of society? A hidden world without access to meat may organically develop a vegetarian ethos. A hidden world with little access to timber may use architecture primarily built around cave structures. There is also the internal economy to consider. This economy will naturally involve the exchange of artifacts with magical properties or properties unique to their world, and the proliferation of these items in the normal world would naturally increase the risk of discovery. How would the government regulate or control the exchange of these items? In our world, the government regulates products with permits, licenses, a registry of peoples with those items, background checks, and the like. Politics. Consider the following questions. 1. What does secrecy mean the government needs to do? 2. Which government structure best accomplishes this? 3. How related is the government to the normal world? The size of the government can be rationalized to either be large or small. Where on the spectrum yours sits will depend on a number of factors. In some stories, the intense and widespread fear of discovery necessitates a large government with extreme surveillance capabilities. This gives a lot of central control and unity to the people in protecting themselves. This seems to be the case with the Knights Templar in Assassin's Creed, Brotherhood of 40, who have recording devices in every car and hold intensely detailed profiles on citizens they wish to monitor. This is enabled by their vast technological powers and excessive financial resources that dwarfs that of their enemies. In other stories, the difficulty in administering the law caused by being secret necessitates a small and decentralized government, like in Jim Butcher's The Dresden Files. This places more power in the hands of local communities in hopes they will more efficiently regulate themselves. This may because of distance between hidden groups, difficulty in traveling between them, or lack of communication between them. Without those capabilities, central control becomes more difficult. But the relationship your world has with the normal world is crucial to consider. If these two or more populations live among one another, even if one does not know the other exists, then it is likely that political and social trends in one world will affect the trends in the other. These may be trends towards democracy, accountability, fascism, or bureaucracy. However, if your hidden world is separate, perhaps socially or especially geographically, then a government trends will not so easily affect the hidden world. For example, the Ministry of Magic in the Harry Potter series became more accountable and democratic during the Enlightenment because wizards lived among muggles and thus inherited their good ideas. Just as the Western countries changed how their countries operated, so did the wizarding world. Consider how secrecy creates unique challenges for your government, and what kind of government and policy is best set up to address them. Likewise, the more separate a hidden world is, socially and geographically, the more its socio-political discourse will develop at a different rate. This can be faster, slower, or in a wholly different direction. Society. Consider how secrecy affects societal structure and values. If its safety is dependent on a select few with the ability to sustain the magical veil, then perhaps they will be the upper class as the most important members of society. Perhaps children are ostracized for socializing with normals. In X-Men, Magneto espouses values of elitism, and he encourages mutants to not keep themselves secret, even if that means violence. As with politics, the more separate the hidden world is geographically and socially from the normal world, the more their values, languages, and social structures will evolve independently of one another. Think about the point they diverged. What would they inherit from that point, and how would social values change from that point onward? This would be fascinating to explore if, say, the hidden world isolated itself before the Renaissance or the Enlightenment. They would not benefit from those revolutionary changes. In contrast, if they separated themselves before the fall of Rome, then perhaps they would not suffer from its downfall. Why this society stays hidden? Realistic world-building requires a realistic reason that a whole society would undertake a cumbersome, time-intensive, and expensive measure to ensure they are never found by a large group of people, most of whom probably would not want to kill them on the spot, especially if your hidden world's counterpart is modern Western civilization, which it is 90% of the time. Most of the time, this boils down to some variant of the "oh, the world is not ready" trope, either because they are a little bit terrified of being murdered by the normal world, or they believe they are better off without the normies. Both the former and the latter are easy to understand if time and isolation has fostered a number of unhealthy stereotypes about those in the normal world. This excuse may seem fine at first glance, but it quickly unravels as realistic world building when you consider the secret world problem. It does not matter how dangerous it would be or how great of a punishment exposing the world would incur. If there is something to be gained by exposing it, then people will. This is most commonly the problem with secret world villains who have every motivation to reveal their world. Often they will profit financially from exposing magic or their technology. They might gain notoriety or power and influence in social circles. Once again we return to Artemis Fowl in the Opal Deception. There, the villain wants to spark an interspecies war with humanity. Opal is certainly not deterred by the thought of breaking the law or that her world could be in danger. That, as it happens, is kind of the point. Some world builders get around this by making the villain only interested in the hidden world, or at least that they need to control the hidden world before they can go out to conquer the normal world. Voldemort in Harry Potter is one such example. Though he believes Muggles to be wholly inferior, he clearly understands that the wizarding world needs to be his before he can advance his interests in the open in the Muggle one. The ethical question, is hiding moral? In Ryan Coogler and Joe Robert Cole's Black Panther, Wakanda hides its riches, technology, and wisdom that could help the rest of the world. Hidden societies in fantasy and science fiction often have access to healing or practical extraordinary abilities that the normal world would benefit from. In this film, the antagonist legitimately asks whether they should share it. Tackling this question would make your story a more unique take on the masquerade trope, because authors often ignore it. However, it naturally generates a wider conflict that can, and arguably should, dominate the narrative if you are going to bring it up at all. One way to avoid this question is to build a narrative conflict that only affects the hidden world, meaning the characters will not have to consider the normal world. This is why the stakes in the Harry Potter books very rarely concern Muggles directly. Umbridge taking over the school would not impact Muggles in any meaningful way immediately, so the characters do not have to consider the question. Even so, if your story does affect the normal world, then it is important to consider how this question fits in with the morality of your characters. Why would they reveal the hidden world, and why would they consider it justified to keep it secret? An individual might reveal the hidden world for personal reasons. The more integrated into normal society they are, the more likely they will reveal the hidden one for love, friendship, research, or simple curiosity. Ultimately, it comes back to the secret world problem. It does not matter how dangerous it would be or how great of a punishment exposing the world would incur. If there is something to be gained by exposing it, then people will. Because of this, the struggle of the hidden world is not eliminating the chance that people let the word out, but minimizing the motivation to do so. The world building just needs to make it rare enough that the normals do not bat an eye at the times information does get out. This leads on to our next point. Geography and population. Playing into the likelihood that these reasons to divulge the existence of the hidden world come up are population and geographical isolation. Imagine you have a secret and you share it with one person. There are only 2 chances for it to get out, and the other guy is not going to share it if he knows he will get caught. Now imagine it is 100 people keeping that same secret. It becomes a lot harder. Not only are there 100 chances for it to be shared for any of the aforementioned reasons, but there is low risk of discovering who shared it first, meaning that sense of consequences is diminished. Now imagine that on a scale of thousands, if not millions. By that point, it becomes virtually impossible. In Guillermo del Toro's Trollhunters series, there are not millions or even tens of thousands of trolls. Their population is relatively limited, and they are mostly concentrated to a single underground city. This makes the secret a lot easier to keep, especially when there are only a few entrances, and they are heavily controlled by the government. When world building your hidden society, the smaller the population, the fewer the chances word will get out, and the higher the risk of finding who did it, making that risk a deterrent. Having the people geographically concentrated also makes them easier to track down, reinforcing that motivation to stay secret, and to be prevents individuals from integrating into normal society, which would encourage them to build relationships that lead to divulging their existence. It can feel unrealistic to have large, hidden, geographically spread out societies, but a concentrated and close-knit one might just work for logical world building. Hidden worlds and narrative. There is a good reason people like the masquerade trope. The idea that there is this hidden fantastical world just adjacent to our own, hidden in forests, underground, or through a magical veil, that the ordinary person can find is enticing. Inasmuch as we the readers engross ourselves in a fictional world stuck to the page, we wish we could immerse ourselves in the world just beyond our reach out in the real one. Just beyond the rainbow. It is easy for the reader to place themselves in the story, to believe this world is out there because it is often grounded in our world. The Harry Potter series begins in the mundane backstreets of Surrey. Sunnydale in Buffy the Vampire Slayer is a generic, familiar California town. It is because of this underlying aim for many authors in using hidden worlds to easily ground the reader in their world that hidden world stories are often accompanied by 3 narrative points. 1. The hidden world is set alongside the contemporary human world we know. 2. The protagonist is a human who discovers this world near the beginning of the story. 3. The story regularly gives recognizable things a second magical meaning. In Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief, the story is set in the early 2000s. The hidden Greek myth world is centered around the United States. Its protagonist, Percy, is the age of the average reader and knows nothing of this world, but he discovers it in the first chapter as the reader does, and the story gives the Empire State Building, a recognizable mundane thing, a second magical meaning as the entrance to Olympus. This trilogy of tropes set up collectively makes the reader identify with the protagonist and their journey, and helps them believe this fictional world. The problem is this: there is no real reason you need to use these 3 tropes in writing a hidden society story. You could have a hidden world based in the far future, or ancient history like Assassin's Creed. You could have a character immersed in the hidden world from the beginning like DC Comics' Constantine, or base the hidden world on an alien planet with nothing familiar to our own. I would love to see a story where the normals are not even human. Constructing your hidden world narrative to so heavily rely on those 3 tropes can lead to your story feeling stale and unoriginal because of how often they have been used, especially in the young adult fantasy genre. While they can help a reader ground themselves in your story and empathize with your main character, there are other creative ways to accomplish the same thing without drawing on these relatively overused tropes. Summary. 1. Consider the means of hiding. A magical means works best when it fits logically within your magic system, meaning a softer magic system may be better suited. The more your hidden people can blend in, the less they will need extreme magic or technological hiding strategies, and the higher the risk of exposure as they build relationships in the normal world. The more geographically isolated they are, the more an us versus them mentality will evolve with stereotypes that go unchallenged. 2. Consider the means of cover-up. The less accessible, more difficult, and more morally grey the method is, the harder it will be to use it to sustain the masquerade. Disbelief is an underrated factor. It need not be foolproof as a method, exposure just needs to be rare enough to be dismissible. 3. Consider how secrecy will affect resource supply and government regulation. Secrecy may demand centralized or decentralized power depending on the challenges the society faces, and the more separate it is from the normal society, the more distinct its political setup will become. The closer they are, the more they will inherit and exchange with the normal culture in terms of politics, finance, and art. Consider when it became secret, how does this divergence change societal morals and social structure? 4. The secret world problem is that it does not matter how dangerous revealing the world is, if there is something to be gained, then people will. You could aim at minimizing this problem or tackling the genuine ethical questions, but it would unrealistic world building to dismiss it entirely. It might be more realistic to engage with the question in the narrative, though this can result in it dominating the story. 5. The smaller a hidden world is and the more geographically isolated and close-knit it is, the lower the risk of discovery with fewer chances for word to get out, and the higher the risk of being caught. 6. Hidden world stories are often accompanied by the 3 tropes that help the reader identify with the main character and immerse themselves in your world, but there is no requirement to use these. Relying heavily on them can feel unoriginal. 7. Fundamentally, if you are wholly concerned with purely realistic and logical world building, a hidden world story may not be the way to go. Part 14. How Empires Rise. History consultant for the 3-part series on empires, Travis Lee Fuchs, curator for Egyptology and Middle Eastern artifacts. Houston Museum of Natural Science, 5555 Herman Park Drive, Houston, TX 77030, PhD student in Bronze Age Civilizations, BA in Anthropology, Islamic Studies, and Pre-Renaissance History, MA in Mediterranean History, Rice University, 6100 Main Street, Houston, TX 77005. Star Wars by George Lucas, Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin, Avatar, The Last Airbender by Michael DiMartino, and Brian Konietzko, Dune by Frank Herbert, Code Geass by Ichi Ikuchi, and Gore Taniguchi, Timeline 191 by Harry Turtledove, Steel World by B.V. Larson. What causes the rise of an empire? Well, you need 1,000 food and 800 gold to start, but that is not the point. When while building a fictional empire, you have to figure out its shape, by which I mean which planets is it centered on, why does it expand to certain kingdoms, but not others, where are its borders, and why does it stop there of all places? Any number of factors are involved in determining this, but we will be looking at 3 important motivations for empire building that lead to different kinds of empire: resources, security, and nationalism. Before we delve into this, let me point to the most important thing an author can do in while building a realistic empire: study the accounts of real historical empires, why they rose, what sustained them, and why they fell. A good grasp of history will always be the best possible education when writing history. This part will raise some important points and questions, but studying real empires is vital to realism. Resources. Needing resources is a major motivation for empire building. An empire motivated by a need for resources gives 2 points of guidance in constructing your empire. 1. This gives you a geographic map of where your empire will be trying to exert force. This includes considering the geography and landmass of the homeland. Which resources does your homeland not have that it needs or wants, and where does have those resources? Portugal wanted valuable dyes, woods, as well as spices that it did not have access to itself. Where did have all that? Brazil. 2. The result of a homeland empire building for resources is that its strategy in doing so has an economic backbone. It will also help determine the way in which the empire exerts force, through resource control. If your fictional world economy runs on naval trade, the empire would naturally desire a strong navy, and its strategy would revolve around controlling crucial ports around the world. If your science fiction empire has an emphasis on space routes for trade, or there are particular trading planets, then controlling them is crucial for establishing a viable empire. It is the same thing. It is about controlling points through which capital and resources flow. This is partly why control of the planet Coruscant in the Star Wars series was so vital to control, and it was an important planet at the end of dozens of trading routes. Sometimes resource-motivated empires do not rely on overt hostile military invasion, but instead acquire trade deals, impose taxes on their exports, tariffs on their imports, and extract resources to enrich the homeland, even if backed up by the barrel of a gun. This is what Britain was partly famous for doing in India, New Zealand, Canada, and Kenya. 41. In contrast, its focus could be on eliminating trade it does not control. Control of the Silk Road connecting the East and the West was critical to controlling the economy of the Mongolian Empire. In its early days, Genghis Khan destroyed a number of southern Arabian and Turkish cities to eliminate trade routes he could not as easily control. Thus, trade was forced to go through his one Silk Road, ensuring his economic predominance. One underestimated factor in the way an empire expands is climate. The British Empire usually brought legal traditions in the courts and parliament to places they colonized, but they quickly discovered that the hot climate of Kenya and other African colonies was intolerable and deadly, with a huge host of diseases they could not fight. Realizing this, their focus switched from colonization to extraction, primarily taking resources to enrich the homeland. A similar strategy was adopted by other European powers, with the King of Belgium ruling the Congo Free States ruthlessly. Where the people of an empire have no real interest in colonizing a land the empire takes for its resources, they may resort to a similar extraction strategy unless there is good reason for them to act otherwise. This is often more brutal to those living there, as it does not necessarily bring with it the legal structures and rights that citizens would usually be entitled to. This is often caused by how inhospitable the climate or environment is. A notable factor in considering these questions is how big you want the landmass of the empire's homeland to be. Generally, smaller homelands have fewer and less diverse resources, meaning they are more likely to be resource-driven than larger states. Think Great Britain, Portugal, and the Dutch Empire, all of which dominated naval trade in their heyday. A world fractured into islands, like the archipelago of Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea, may be more likely to have resource-driven empires. The Fire Nation from Avatar, The Last Airbender, is a great example of all of this theory put into fictional practice. The Fire Nation's comparatively small size means resources are a crucial element of their expansion strategy. Their need for the coal, wood, and iron-rich deposits of the northwestern Earth Kingdom determine the shape of the Fire Empire. At the beginning of the war, this area was their priority to colonize and control. Beyond this, knowing the world economy is largely in the naval trade, they built a strong navy and focused on controlling port cities within the Earth Kingdom to manipulate trade and impose taxes to enrich the homeland. They also have a strong worker base when it comes to captured enemy soldiers. However, there is an inverse version of this, where the homeland controls the majority or monopolizes an extremely valuable resource that other nations require. This helps determine two things. 1. The monopoly may help determine the political structure of the empire. A great example of this is how Iraqis in Frank Herbert's Dune is the only place in the universe that has the resource of the spice, which is described in that fashion that, without it there is no commerce in the empire, there is no civilization. He who controls it, controls our destiny. It is practically just an empire built on space cocaine. The result of this monopoly is that it becomes the capital of the Atreides empire. The powers that be center around controlling that resource which has become so valuable. Other powerful factions like the Bene Gesserit and the Guild Navigators of the Spacing Guild also ensure they have representatives there. This center of power is built because of resources. 2. The monopoly may also help determine the shape of the empire. It is driven to preserve itself against those who would wish to take that precious resource, so it would naturally move to subdue those nearby who pose the greatest threats. This moves into a discussion of self-defense that we will get to in the section on security. Read therefore more detail. If you are looking for a unique setup for your story about an empire, then this may be it. It is more common that empires are seen as extractionist, but if the welfare and economy of a homeland is heavily related to control and trade of a certain resource, then those who control that resource will naturally wield power in any empire that comes from that, either directly in a monarchical or feudal sense or indirectly by influencing those in power or society through social capital. It may create a cultural, economic, and political center for the empire, and that setup could be really fascinating to play with. Considering which resources your homeland has and which resources it needs gives shape to the empire by determining where in your fictional universe it will assert its power. It also helps determine how it goes about doing so, by manipulating trade, colonization, or extraction. Ownership and location of valuable resources within the empire can also affect the political structure of the state. Security. Security is an empire-building force in two important ways. 1. It is why certain people groups across an area join together. 2. Empires form after acquiring new land in the fallout of wars against neighboring kingdoms, states, planets, and galaxies. The early Romans are a great example of both of these. They were a bunch of disconnected villages positioned at a strategic point along the Tiber River. This position attracted attention from the Latins, Sabines, Volscians, and Etruscans. As a result, this collection of villages were forced to band together to form a city-state. They formed together for security, and after their victories over the Etruscan city of Veii or the neighboring city of Tusculum, the Romans subsumed the land and incorporated the defeated inhabitants into the state, growing the size of the empire. Some empires establish a foothold in the land of peoples who attack them as a security measure to ensure their enemies will not attack them again. This grows the empire. In the same way resource empires are given shape by where the resources are, security-based empires are given shape by defensible borders, mountains, canyons, coastlines, or the deep Ardennes forest that no army could possibly blitzkrieg. An empire may be more motivated by security depending on their geography. For example, the Mongolian homeland across the Eurasian steppe lacks a naturally defensible coastline, and doesn't have an easily defensible southern border. With the Chinese to the south and Turks to the west, to secure their homeland, Genghis Khan brought surrounding nations to heel to establish more defensible borders and create a secure position for his homeland with a huge buffer zone between them and potential threats, as well as to prevent the Turks and Chinese from rising again. Within this, while a resource-based empire may more often arise from small nations or islands, large or land-based nations without coastlines, especially those that are landlocked, may be driven by security with naturally less defensible borders. The Britannian Empire in Code Geass is an interesting mix. At the beginning, its shape was determined by a need for security. It conquered its neighbors in the Americas as a means to protect itself and create a more robust resistance to enemy empires. But as a rare material, saccharide became more valuable in the war, it decided to conquer Japan, where it could be found. Empires do not conquer places randomly, they choose them for specific reasons. However, people groups in an area do not just unite under a single figurehead for mutual security against external threats, but also internal threats like bandits. Being a single political entity means the roads and areas between cities can be more effectively policed, making both travel and trade easier within their borders. Commerce leads to prosperity, stability, and peace in an empire. It is also no longer up to one town to deal with their own problems, they can draw from a greater pool of resources. Nationalism. Nationalism is a complex ideology with caveats and different interpretations that mean it cannot be reduced to being called good, bad, evil, or oppressive. Necessarily, it carries with it a modern and historical socio-political context that means people associate it with a number of past and ongoing social and political movements. This book is not intentionally giving a commentary on any particular movement, other than those named and explained here, and any commentary you extract otherwise is your own. Nationalism is also thought of as a relatively modern concept, but an objective definition of nationalism in one form or another can be seen throughout history, even if it was not called that. We are not just talking about the Nazis, okay? Nationalism is a strange creature that can arise equally out of strife and prosperity. The Republic and later Galactic Empire is one example that arose out of strife. A galaxy-wide war, economic downturn, and fear of losing their way of life and traditions spurred a nationalistic wave in hopes of a safe and secure society. In Palpatine's own words, becoming an empire is seen as a way to prevent that decay, to guard against the loss of something that was once magnificent. On the other hand, we see how the Fire Nation's nationalism in Avatar, The Last Airbender, arises out of prosperity in Fire Lord Sozin's sentiment. Sozin, our nation is enjoying an unprecedented time of peace and wealth. Our people are happy, and we're so fortunate in so many ways. Roku, where are you going with this? Sozin, I've been thinking, we should share this prosperity with the rest of the world. In our hands is the most successful empire in history. It's time we expanded it. The desire to build an empire does not come from fear of loss of their way of life, but out of this righteous belief that their way of life is better, and thus they have a right, or even duty, to spread it across the rest of the world. However, nationalism naturally enters the narrative of a story in a curious way that other forces do not. A desire for resources or security is not necessarily as personal to your everyday lumberjack, kitchen maid, or shoe shiner. It was the Britannian military who needed the resource security, and security on the border is usually dealt with by the government, even if individuals from all tiers of society are involved. In contrast, nationalism is a force that permeates the mindset of everyday citizens on a very personal level. It involves traditions, rituals, and ideas that run in the veins of everyday life. It is easy to have nationalism through banners and rallies, but it can be more effective to show nationalism through how your characters think, that it is their traditions that are dying out, that it is their values that are superior, that it is their economy that gives them such prosperity. This was very much the case when it came to the expansion of the early Islamic caliphates, which had a strong economy and academic culture that led to revolutions in science and mathematics for the day, but they also had a unifying religion they believed others should adhere to as well. Nationalism revolves around the traditions, philosophies, religions, and ways of life that people value and care about on a deep and personal level. It is important to keep in mind how it can play into characters' motivations, their relationships with those who come from that nationalistic environment, and those who do not, and societal elements like how they would want their education system to run. This also presents a challenge for protagonists that grow up within the possibly racist, sexist, or condescending cultural environment of their empire. 42. Why do they not adhere to this nationalistic ideology, or the racist or sexist undertones, when everyone else does? Curiously, writers do not often give a reason for such a difference, if there is one. They are just inexplicably, naturally more moral. Avatar, The Last Airbender does a great job of this with Prince Zuko of the Fire Nation. He did grow up in this nationalistic state, and it takes a difficult personal transformation for him to break down those preconceptions he has been taught. He is not just magically better, and one of the most climactic moments of the series involves him seeing through the nationalistic lie. The following is taken from The Day of Black Sun Part 2, The Eclipse. Zuko, no, I've learned everything. And I've had to learn it on my own. Growing up, we were taught that the Fire Nation was the greatest civilization in history. And somehow, the war was our way of sharing our greatness with the rest of the world. What an amazing lie that was. The people of the world are terrified by the Fire Nation. They don't see our greatness. They hate us. And we deserve it. We've created an era of fear in the world. And if we don't want the world to destroy itself, we need to replace it with an era of peace and kindness. Let us talk about the political structure behind nationalism. It is totally understandable to think that nationalism must lead to fascism with recent historical experiences like Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, but fascism does not necessarily